but of course the Constitution makes no such claim. What did Vallandigham do? He called the war wicked and cruel and called Lincoln King Lincoln and charged that Lincoln's tax law was the like of which has never been seen upon any but a conquered people. Case ex parte Milligan, a man named Milligan's treasonable conduct was tried and the jury found insufficient evidence to convict or indict him. A military court then took over, convicted him, and sentenced him to death. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, had ruled that his arrest was illegal and Lincoln did not have the authority to suspend habeas corpus without congressional approval. Lincoln not only disregarded the ruling, he was so outraged he issued an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court because he disagreed with his ruling. Later, however, President Andrew Johnson restored habeas corpus so it could be brought before the Supreme Court, who released Milligan and condemned the past 5 years of phony military arrests, and this was illegal. This is why the moral component of the Civil War became louder as the war went on, because as the war was going on, Europe was looking at America and asking themselves, should we help the Confederacy? But John Stuart Mill came to Lincoln's rescue after he, a European, would first concoct the idea that the Civil War was about slavery. And when Lincoln became aware that he could kill two birds with one stone, not only keeping Europe out of aiding the Confederacy, but also giving much needed moral justification for the Civil War, because only supreme moral reason could justify all the illegal activities he has engaged in. After all, Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Here Lincoln says clearly that the Civil War is not about freeing slaves, it's about keeping the Union together at all costs. Although his personal wish is that slavery end, that's not why he's fighting this war. He will keep slavery if it means keeping the Union together. But as Lincoln continued to break the law and hundreds of thousands of people were dying to protect Northern economic and territorial interests, Lincoln needed a moral justification for all this wrongdoing. That's why the moral component of slavery became louder during the Civil War, not because, as this author says, that it just became more and more fixed in his mind. But the video continues.
And as the war progressed, the moral component, ending slavery, became more and more fixed in his mind. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law.
This is another lie. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did absolutely nothing in any legal sense. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in southern territories which the Union didn't even control. It did nothing, which is why when Union General Fremont emancipated the slaves in his military district in Missouri, Lincoln promptly dismissed Fremont, rescinded his emancipation order, and sent the slaves back to their masters. Lincoln said of the incident, quote, "It was a war for the great national idea, the Union, and General Fremont should not have dragged the Negro into it." Fighting Joe Hooker wrote in response to the Emancipation Proclamation, a large element of the Army had taken sides against it, declaring that they would never have embarked in the war had they anticipated this action of the government. Another Union officer, a colonel, wrote, "Let it be understood that if this is a war for emancipation of the Negro, instead of a war in defense of the Constitution, 3/4 of the Army would lay down their arms." Lincoln said in his Emancipation, quote, "Testing whether the nation can long endure." That comment seems to presuppose that the South was out to conquer the North, which is just as absurd as saying that the revolting colonies in 1776 were out to destroy Great Britain. The Chicago Times wrote, "If there was ever a non sequitur in the annals of human warfare, that was it. All the South wanted was to withdraw from the Union and be left alone. How could that threaten the political institutions of the North or the right of free government?" Lincoln also said in his proclamation, "And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." Why did Lincoln even suggest that secession by Southern states would mean that democracy would perish from the earth? H.L. Mencken wrote about the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, "But let us not forget that it is poetry, not logic, beauty, not sense. Think of the argument in it. Put it into cold words every day. The doctrine is simply this, that the Union soldiers who died at Gettysburg sacrificed their lives to the cause of self-determination. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. It is difficult to imagine anything more untrue. The Union soldiers in the battle actually fought against self-determination. It was the Confederates who fought for the right of their people to govern themselves. Even abolitionists saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a fraud, as it only applied to the territory over which the North had no control. It was thus an illusion. The North didn't care about minorities of color at all, whether black or Indian or of any color. Union General Sherman expressed his views about Indians after the Civil War in a letter to President Grant, writing, quote, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination. Men, women, and children, nothing else will reach the root of this case." Sherman was to call the massacre of all American Indians Indians his final solution to the Indian problem. Before Sherman died in 1891, he complained bitterly about civilian interference in his Indian policies, which had prevented him from, quote, getting rid of them all. But the video continues.
Slavery is the great shame of America's history. No one denies that. But it's to America's everlasting credit that it fought the most devastating war in its history in order to abolish slavery. As a soldier, I am proud that the United States Army, my Army, defeated the Confederates. In its finest hour, soldiers wearing this blue uniform.
So here you can see the motivation for the belief in the war being to free the slaves. He mentions earlier in the video that Southerners searched for a different reason for the war, to absolve themselves of defending the repugnant system. In reality, the narrative that the Civil War was about slavery stands because the victors get to write the history of the war, and fighting a war to free slavery is something to be proud of. Certainly much more prideful than fighting an illegal war for economic and territorial interests. The idea that the Civil War was for slavery is a fable told to justify an otherwise illegal war that 660,000 Americans lost their lives in, and it was illegal. After the Civil War, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was captured and arrested. It was going to be the trial of the century, and Northerners salivated waiting to get the chance to see this traitor hanged in public. However, when the smoke of the war cleared and emotions calmed down, upon examining the case of the South, it became overwhelmingly clear that the Confederacy actually had a really good case for the legality of secession. The Union chose as their leading trial prosecutor John J. Clifford, but after reviewing the case, Clifford withdrew, arguing that he had grave doubts about the case and that the government could end up having fought a successful war only to have it declared unlawful. A year passed after Clifford withdrew, and famous author and lawyer Richard Dana of Boston, who wrote the great novel 2 Years Before the Mass, was chosen to lead the prosecution of Jefferson Davis. But he too declined the case after deciding that it was a loser, and wrote a lengthy brief given to the president taking Clifford's position that they were going to lose this trial. The North was desperately trying to find a way to get out of taking Jefferson Davis to trial, because they know, along with Jefferson Davis's lawyers, that if this goes to trial and Jefferson Davis is ruled innocent, it would mean a war that cost the lives of 660,000 Americans was illegal, and it would have been a PR nightmare that has never been seen. So President Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination, offered Jefferson Davis a pardon. Jefferson Davis declined, saying signing a pardon would be agreeing that he committed a crime and he believed he did no such thing. Yes, Jefferson Davis wanted his day in court because he knew he would be ruled innocent. Davis was in prison for a year before making bond provided by abolitionist Horace Greeley. After 2 years had passed since his arrest, only the Attorney General's office could try the case, and as other lawyers declined, they came up with an amazing solution to avoid trial. The 14th Amendment had been adopted, which provided that anyone who had engaged in insurrection against the United States and had at one time taken an oath of allegiance, which Jefferson Davis had done as a U.S. Senator, could not hold public office. The Bill of Rights prevents double jeopardy, and thus Davis, who had already been punished once by the 14th Amendment in not being permitted to hold public office, couldn't be tried and punished again for treason. This loophole enabled the North to avoid a trial that would have officially ruled the Civil War illegal. The Civil War was not about slavery. It's really obvious when actually looking at the facts. It's easy to see how this could come about because the side effect of the Civil War was that it did bring about the end of slavery. So the natural assumption is that this was the goal, but it wasn't. The side effect of a certain decision is not indicative of the intentions that influenced the original decision. For example, Lance Armstrong took performance-enhancing drugs, won a bunch of races, became world famous, and raised millions of dollars for cancer research, which is a noble thing. But that's not why Lance Armstrong took performance-enhancing drugs. He took them to get a competitive advantage and win. Just because his drug usage had a very positive side effect of raising money for cancer does not mean his motivation for taking the drugs in the first place was the positive outcome that resulted. Similarly, the Civil War and the Union's victory had a wonderful result of abolishing slavery, but that was not the motivation for the war itself. The reality is, when Lincoln increased the Morrill tariff to 50% shortly after his election and the Confederacy opened a free trade port in the South, the Northern economy was under serious threat. The South could buy textiles from European countries at a cheaper price without tariffs, making the manufacturing economy in the North obsolete. And this was not something that Lincoln was willing to accept, so he fought it, and that's how the Civil War actually happened. Some will argue things like, yes, the South seceded for their rights, but primarily for their rights to own slaves. This is a stupid argument because slavery slavery was already legal in the Union during the Civil War. In Union states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, slavery was legal during the Civil War, so that would not be a reason to secede over. Lincoln already offered protection of slavery in his inauguration and said during the war that he would keep slavery if it meant keeping the Union. Slavery was not under threat of abolition at the time of secession. There were no proposals, initiatives, or rumors of upcoming proposals or initiatives that would threaten slavery from the North, so seceding over that is nonsense. Some will object to this by saying the South didn't secede over the tariffs because the tariff was only 20% at the time South Carolina seceded. It's true that the moral tariff didn't go up to 50% until after many of the Confederate states seceded, and that when the initial secession occurred, the tariff was only 20%. But this objection assumes that wealthy business owners who are lobbying politicians are completely ignorant of potential legislative changes that may affect their businesses, but that assumption is wrong. For example, even in present day, Walmart was to open several locations among the Washington, D.C. area. Then the $15 minimum wage discussion started to become popular. Even though D.C. had not yet implemented or passed legislation to implement a $15 minimum wage, Walmart realized what was on the horizon for D.C. and canceled their plans to open new locations in Washington, D.C. To say the South didn't secede because of the tariff is like saying Walmart didn't cancel plans to open locations in D.C. because of the $15 minimum wage. Even though it wasn't an official law yet, they could see the writing on the wall and pulled out a building in D.C. because of it. And sure enough, they were right. The $15 minimum wage would end up passing and being implemented into law. Just like Walmart, importers and exporters in the South knew full well that once Lincoln was elected, tariffs would increase, and 2 months after Lincoln stepped into office, they were right, and the tariff went to 50%. Here's a few honest questions to ask yourself when considering whether the Civil War was actually about slavery or not. Was there any legislative proposal whatsoever to end slavery prior to the Civil War? If the North so badly wanted to end slavery, wouldn't a diplomatic attempt be the first course? Wouldn't the North try to negotiate for the abolition of slavery and offer concessions to make it happen before war? Why would the first proposed legislation to end slavery come after 600,000 people died in a war over it? And why would it not apply to freeing slaves in the North? If this was a noble war over slavery, why did Lincoln shut down over 300 newspapers? What was he afraid they were going to say? Why did Lincoln send 75,000 men in arms and order a naval blockade over a battle that cost 0 human lives? Isn't that a little extreme? Why would states secede over slavery when Lincoln in his inaugural address only emphasized the protection of it? How come after the slaves were freed, there was no plan whatsoever to integrate them? Is it because abolition of slavery wasn't something they planned for, but were being opportunist and jumped on as justification for a long list of illegal activity and didn't really think it out? Why would Lincoln start the most bloody war in American history for a group of people he believed to be so inferior? None of it makes sense. At least, if the Civil War was about slavery, it doesn't make sense. The Civil War was not about slavery.